joining us today. Um, in a few minutes, Jesse and Marlo will be talking about several CTIP initiatives. Our national campaign to educate Congress about trauma and our effort to provide information to states about how to tap into the uh, CARES Act funding. But the purpose of this call has a much larger goal. And as Elizabeth indicated, the overriding purpose is to see if there's value in the creation of these regional consortiums of statewide trauma-informed coordinators like you. I've indicated, I've talked to many of you, and I kept hearing the same kinds of things over and over again. You're all doing some amazing work. You're all wrestling with the same problems of how to structure yourselves, how to build momentum, how to come together. And it struck me that there was value in all of you sharing with each other. So you're not reinventing the wheel and you're benefiting from each other's successes and from each other's struggles. So we're hoping that this call is the first in a continuing series of calls that CTIP and ACES Connection will be glad to promote or sponsor to give you an opportunity at the regional level to share, again, both your successes and your struggles, and hopefully benefit from that. And this really is our pilot project, and we're hoping that after this, we'll be able to replicate this approach throughout the country. We're talking to people in the Midwest now. With that, again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being part of what I think is an important new initiative in which we have national organizations like CTIP and ACES Connection partnering with regional and statewide entities. I think it just makes a very powerful force to achieve our goal of making America trauma-informed. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jesse to talk about the CTIP national campaign, followed by Marlo talking about the CARES Act, and then we'll go into the discussion among yourselves.
Thank you, Dan, very much. It's truly a privilege to be here with you all. I have a unique opportunity to get to work on the national level with CTIP, as well as have some involvement at the statewide level with Pennsylvania. And the importance of coming together to advocate for the issues that we are trying to promote cannot be more important. The more webinars that I am a part of, the more of these conversations that I have the privilege to be a part of, the more that I see we are all speaking a similar language, and there are a lot of people that do not understand how, if we put a little bit of money up front to prevent a lot of these issues that result from trauma or ACEs, we end up spending so much more than we could have up front. So what the National Trauma Campaign is really trying to do is organize people around trauma-related issues, advocating to Congress to create, hopefully, the real goal is funding streams to work toward promoting a trauma-informed nation. As you saw on the last slide, our ultimate goal is to promote, to create a comprehensive trauma-informed federal legislation that will then be able to pass down funds where we hope that we will see programs in states, in grassroots communities, being able to provide the care that we all know is so necessary for people in our nation. And then through that, over time, we believe that we'll see reduction in costs, which can then be reinvested into these programs more and really develop that comprehensive vision of what a trauma-informed nation could look like. So really quickly, for purposes of the campaign, everybody on this call is already a champion in their own state. Some of the people on the call are already involved with the National Trauma Campaign, but if you are not already, we really, really encourage for you to sign up and join and use your voice to advocate for these issues on the federal as well as the state and local levels like you're already doing. So on the screen I've shared, you can see our National Trauma Campaign website. It's ctip.org/National Trauma Campaign. We have a number of tools that you would be able to use at the national level, certainly, but also a lot of the talking points are similar at the state and at the local levels about why this sort of legislation is so important. So you can see our toolkits we have available under the Take Action section. I really want to encourage people to go to this Constituent Engagement section. And if you're an individual, sign up as a local liaison. And if you're an organization, we encourage you to sign up as both a local liaison and sign your organization up. The last thing on the website that I'll point people toward before turning it over to Marlo are just the resources that we have available. You'll see a policy analysis tool that we have to do in the light of COVID legislation to make sure that COVID legislation is being done in a trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive lens. There's a number of other resources that we have. Want you to take a look at the infographics, which another core team member who's on the call right now, Whitney, who is representing the Institute for Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, created these infographics to really be a visual appeal to a congressperson when discussing trauma-related issues. So I invite you to check out our website again, ctip.org/National Trauma Campaign. Sign up to join the campaign, invite your network, and feel free to use the resources as it can best help you, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it over to Marlo.
I am delighted to be here with you all today. We've been doing this presentation for a number of groups. I think in the last couple of weeks, we've reached over 1,000 folks. And what we tried to do this morning is actually tighten it up a little bit in the hopes that we can answer specific questions, because as the weeks go on and we do this work, we're learning what are some of the things that are helpful for people like you to know about how to take advantage of what I'm going to talk about. But before I jump in, I just want to say one of the reasons I'm so happy to be with you all as a group is because I'm from Oklahoma. So the Midwest really speaks to my heart. And I also represent St. Francis Ministries, as Elizabeth said in my introduction. And we are an organization that rebuilds family and child well-being, largely in partnership with child welfare systems. And we have physical presence in Oklahoma, Nebraska, Arkansas, Texas, and Kansas is our headquarters state. So we've been there the longest. And we also have a project right now in Iowa in partnership with the Coalition for Family and Child Services. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. I'm going to start by talking about the fact that there are resources flowing from the federal government now to states. And we really want to talk through this with you and make sure that you're aware of some of the aspects of these resources and why they offer an opening for the kind of work that you lead in your states with some advocacy and engagement from you. So let me talk through that a minute. And then the second thing I'll talk about in a few minutes is the specific calls to action to the campaign, which you heard a little bit about from Dan and from Jesse, but I'll go down a little deeper into those to help equip you. And again, please chat your questions as I'm presenting. We want to really be as helpful today beyond just giving you information. If there are specific questions we can share with you or strategic advice, let us know. So I'm sure you all have followed news and you know a lot of some of these high level things that I want to talk about, but one is that clearly the pandemic is affecting not only physical but also mental and of course economic health and nearly all public systems. And so far Congress passed 4 new laws in response to the pandemic, and now they're discussing another bill. As many of you who have been through disasters, you know that there's a period of response and a period of recovery, and response are the things you do in the immediate. So much of what has been passed by Congress now is about addressing the physical threat and all of the related issues around that. And there is an assumption that in the future there will be recovery legislation as well that will be about rebuilding the country. We don't know when that turn will take, obviously, because we're still very much in the middle of the physical threat of this crisis. But for perspective, I'll just talk a second about this, but I just want to share this to help you understand how these new laws that are passing in response to COVID-19 will likely affect the federal and state financing landscape for a very long time to come, which is one of the reasons why we think it's so important for you to step into this opening now and make the case for some of these federal dollars to be directed toward trauma-informed care and approaches that build resiliency. So just briefly, the total value of the 4 new laws is over $2 trillion. It's the largest stimulus package since the mid-1930s and what we know as the multiple bills that made up the New Deal at that time. Last year, federal revenue was 3.5 trillion and the US spent 4.4 trillion. So already last year we spent on just regular spending, we spent $1 trillion more than revenue coming in. Just this first round of COVID response represents fully half of what was spent last year pre-pandemic, and that's with the 3.5 plus the 4.4, so fully half after we had already gone $1 trillion over budget. So if you don't think about budgets very often, and I am not one who thinks about budgets very often, the bottom line here is that with that level of spending, it's going to affect all other appropriations for all other services. And we, as I said, we still will need recovery spending at some point. So again, this is why your leadership is so important to step into this opening at this time. So you can go on to the next slide, Jesse. So just a little bit about what we see when we look at those laws that have passed through the lens of trauma and resilient science. None of the 4 federal laws were directed explicitly toward trauma-informed approaches. Mental health is referenced in some of the laws, but the frame is frequently treatment and counseling, and not really this contemplation that we need a public health approach that helps everyone in the daily flow of life be equipped to recognize their own trauma and recognize trauma in others and have ways to respond and also help identify when someone might need additional help. But because mental health and social emotional support is contemplated in some of the language, in other words, some of the appropriated funds make reference mental health supports or emotional and social supports as allowable expenditures in a list of allowable expenditures, there's the opportunity, the opening to direct trauma-informed approaches. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it is particularly there in the Education Stabilization Fund. Just a little bit more about, again, kind of a high-level analysis of law. Issues that cause trauma or result from traumatic experiences receive relatively small allocations. So again, if you think back to what I was saying about there's response and there's recovery, well, right now it's clear that the mind of Congress was on the physical threat and the economic threat, and some, nod to the fact that family violence, child welfare, so child maltreatment, substance use, and suicide prevention are all going up, and will likely go up even more after as we return to daily life at some point in the future. And so a little bit of, millions compared to billions for the physical threat and economic threat. And again, this is where that response sort of timeline versus recovery comes in. It's not that they don't know that that's what those issues are being caused. It's just not what's on the forefront, again, which is why advocacy is needed, because as we all know, there's a silent epidemic going on right now, which is the mental health impact of the physical epidemic that's going on. And there's no requirement for coordination of the use of the funds in states. So a lot of money is coming to states from the federal government. And there's nothing that says they have to work together to try to leverage pieces together. But that's, again, where an advocacy agenda could come in and help point out where those leverage funds could maybe happen. So the next slide. So as I mentioned a minute ago, probably the biggest, clearest opportunity is the Education Stabilization Fund. It's been, the federal government has issued guidance on it, and they've said, we want to get this money to your states quickly. The way the states access the money is a very simple certification form that asks a few questions. The funds are the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is the smallest pot in the overall Education Stabilization Fund, but is entirely flexible for governors to direct the use of that money. And in that language, it does mention offering support for mental health. The larger fund is one of them is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Fund. This also references social emotional supports as an allowable expenditure. The Higher Education Fund is much more kind of practical funding to helping students with student loans, with housing, helping universities with the loss in revenue and things like that. So it does not actually mention social and emotional as one of the allowable expenses. But if you go back up to the Governor's Emergency Education Fund, the Governor's Fund is fully flexible across the whole range of education. So there are opportunities within that to make the case that trauma-informed classrooms, trauma-informed processes, supports, outreach to parents, and all of that is a necessary part of supporting effective learning. Now, I will just parenthetical side note, the more we talk about this topic and learn more, the guidance that's going out is very much focused on distance learning and some of the technology, some of the practical aspects. So even though mental and emotional supports are allowable, the strong message from the administration to state and local governments is, handle the distance learning. And I think the case to make, this is just advice from me, I'll step out of presenting facts and just give advice. The case to make is that social emotional is such a huge part. And what we're hearing is it's actually a bigger factor right now for parents and educators than it is for the students, although the students need their social emotional needs met as well. But the dysregulation is more about the adults in the system right now. And a lot of the supports that are being offered now are, there's an EAP program for employees, there's a hotline number for parents and students to call, which is fantastic, except that we all know that people will usually access those resources when they have already gotten to their limit quite often. And then, so what we're talking about is getting things, again, as I said earlier, more in the daily flow of their life and experience, so that there's a further upstream way for people to help when they're dysregulated, to know ways and have help getting re-regulated. I've listed the block grants here, but I separate them out, and here is why. So there are these 3 block grants coming to states. I want to explain to you why the opening is not quite as clear in these, but you all are advocates, you know your subject, so I want to point out what might be possible here. So the Community Services Block Grant goes to community action agencies. You are probably familiar with your community action agencies. Their main mission is to support and strengthen low-income families and children. So the opening here is not so much that their block grant tells them to spend money on trauma-informed approaches, but it is that they are getting some additional money, and the case could be made that if they don't already deliver their services in a trauma-informed way, that maybe they look for ways to direct some of that grant to help their staff recognize their own trauma and recognize the trauma of their clients. The Community Development Block Grant is very much about economic development for low-income communities, housing. So it does not talk about developing offering mental health supports. What it does talk about is offering the supports that workers need to get back to work when they've been unemployed. And as we all know, supporting them in dealing with what's going on with them socially and their social emotional and dysregulation is part of what's going to help them get back into the workforce. So again, that's an advocacy case to make, but they're getting money that if you convince them to see it that way, or you've already convinced them to see it that way, then they could make the case to the federal government that that's how they want to spend some of that money. The Child Care Development Block Grant I actually have on here because it does not mention mental health and social emotional support. It is largely an economic bill. It's about, we've got to keep child care programs open for essential workers and others who have to have care. So there's a whole national conversation right now about how there is a need to support the social emotional needs of children and parents who use childcare. So that particular fund doesn't offer an opening right now, but it's worth starting the conversation and even advocating at the federal levels that any future investments in childcare allow for making those settings trauma informed and equipped to build resilience. Go ahead, Jesse. So the opening to take action right now is to prepare ideas and strategies that could benefit for either just some are just from coordination and sharing information, because there are a lot of free resources out there right now, and others would require some expenditure from those federal funds. But the case to make really is that the expenditure on this kind of thing that we're talking about, that you do all the time, is relatively minor investment, smaller investment. The cost of letting these things go unattended to will be in the future. And then to reach out to influencers and decision makers and let them know that you're there as a coalition, you believe this needs to happen, and here are ideas, that you can be a solutions-oriented partner. So we have a toolkit on the website that Jesse showed you earlier that gives you resources and information. Happy to answer questions today with the time that we have, and we can be helpful beyond today as well. So now I want to make a very clear break, because what I was just talking to you about is federal money that has already been authorized. It's already on its way in the states, or maybe in play in your state already. These next couple of slides are about going forward with what needs to happen next on the federal level. So we need you, as Jesse said, and I won't take time to say all the things he said before, but we really need you engaged right now. We're supporting that engagement with talking points and messaging and well-timed calls to action. So the call to action right now is, if you don't already have a relationship with your congressional delegation, so each of you as an individual, you have a US rep and 2 US senators. As an organization, you may have more than that if your services cross different congressional districts. But we need you to engage now. Introduce yourself, introduce your work, and say you're really wanting Congress to have a trauma-informed response in future COVID legislation. And then you will have created that open channel of communication. So when we can issue a call to action about specifically what's in that next package that we think needs, that congressional offices need to know we support, we would be sending you that call to action. And then the other thing, and Jesse talked about this as well, we need your help growing the campaign. So if you can help publicize the campaign, engage everyone in your network, folks are able to join as a local liaison, which is kind of a stepped up volunteer role, or you can just join the campaign as a grassroots member, and both can respond to calls to action. But those local liaisons, the distinction is we've asked you to create a relationship around this topic with the appropriate congressional staffer or staffers in your congressional delegation offices. We have tools also to support growing the campaign, as Jesse showed you on the website. So in terms of educating and engaging your congressional delegation, again, you can call the office and identify the staff person, and you'll want to ask for who works on trauma prevention and response, or if they don't know the answer to that question, it would be who works on child welfare or healthcare. So that's the person you want to find. Establish a relationship with that staff person, as I shared with you a moment ago. You'll want to follow up after that meeting to thank them, and you can share additional campaign materials, and then remain in touch. And as I said, we'll equip you with calls to action. Jesse, next slide. We have a toolkit on the website that supports you in this, and we're adding to the toolkit all the time. So one of the things you can let us know is if there's a specific thing you need on any of these things that we are sharing with you that's not already available to you. You can stay in touch with the campaign for updates. And what I can already tell you is that there is activity, unlike that first set of congressional action, the new laws. There wasn't time for activity around lifting up the need for addressing the needs of the trauma responses and the need to rebuild resiliency. But since then, there's been a bipartisan dear colleague letter in the House that was went up to House leadership, articulating some trauma-informed provisions for the next COVID law. A more detailed memo was sent to House leadership. We don't know what was in that. We just know that even more ideas were sent to House leadership than were the handful of ideas in the dear colleague letter. And then that there's activity in the Senate to develop a bipartisan letter that will complement the one in the House. So there's traction for potentially having some some money flow to trauma-informed work in the next law, but it will take demonstrating a groundswell of support to congressional offices, and that takes you. So I've referenced the toolkit. We are delighted. I want to acknowledge that Dr. Shea Soma is on the call today as one of your colleagues in the Midwest, that Star Commonwealth is a partner of the campaign and created a video and an infographic that we link to here. And they also took the initiative to create a national trauma campaign page on their website, which we welcome anyone to do that. So we've given you a link to that sample if you'd like to create a presence for the campaign on your own organizational website. Next slide. So I think we've got the video hyperlinked in a couple of places and the infographic. So I think in the interest of time, we won't go over those now. This is just a sample. We have many infographics like this one. This one actually is a nice one also to pair with the video, because the video addresses some of these, and this gives some more detailed information than is able to fit in the video.
Hi everybody, my name is Peyton Barcel. I'm a resident of Las Vegas. I've lived here my entire life, and I'm 18 years old, so just graduated high school. And I mention that just because I have no formal background in trauma-informed implementation or trauma-informed education, but I was very passionate about issues related to ACEs and trauma-informed learning that I got very involved. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal journey, just as some background. When I was 9, I lost my dad very unexpectedly, and my school really was not adept at how to handle that. And because of that, I felt very isolated in my classrooms and just really struggled. At that age, you really have no sense of you really have no sense of the world. And so it was very difficult for me to understand that this was more of a systemic problem rather than just a situation happening to me. And so it took going through years of peer support groups to finally understand that this was really a systemic problem in our nation. And so I wanted to do something to be able to combat that. And so I, at first, became a facilitator for my peer support group. I was helping about 40 kids a year, which was amazing, but I wanted to do something on a larger level. And eventually I got involved in politics in the local legislature in Nevada. And so after hundreds of hours of just online research on legislative.org, looking through different bills from mental health resources and different trauma training videos, I created Assembly Bill 343, which I presented to the Education Committee in the Nevada Assembly during 2019, that proposed a mandate for all educators to be trained on how to identify and support students who've experienced a traumatic event. And that was originally proposed to be an 8-hour training modeled after mental health first aid, because that was just going to cover really a very large scope of issues. But due to budgetary and time constraints and just the atmosphere of the legislature, that did not end up going through at first. But I had become so well known for what I was doing that the Department of Education reached out to me, and I was put in contact with the Clark County School District, which is the 5th largest school district in the nation and the largest in Nevada. And they had passed a bill Senate Bill 80. That was a Safe to Tell program that had a trauma training component, which I was eventually given complete control to develop. And so there is now a 30-minute training module that has been created that provides instruction on how to respond to negative behavior as an opportunity to teach self-awareness and use attentive listening when speaking to students, essentially removing barriers that these children face to empower them to be able to come forward and talk to their teachers and feel safe and cared for. And so my experience is one where I did not initially have a successful experience in the legislature, but because I built good relationships with the people that I had surrounded, I was able to eventually be able to access this training module that now has to be seen annually. I am also pursuing nationwide implementation through a nonprofit I created called ACE Aware. And so anybody who wants to see that training is able to through that website. It was really important to me that anybody who wanted to access that training was able to. And so I say all of this just as the takeaways for how to get involved is I have no college degree, and I was able to do all of this just because I had a will to. And so go out in your community and volunteer, reach out to a representative, see if there are opportunities in the local legislature. There are a million ways to get involved with the trauma campaign. And I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you go out and help your community.